I've spent a lifetime asking a single, uncomfortable question. Why do otherwise intelligent people, lawyers, investors, generals, CEOs, parents, so often reach the wrong conclusion at the wrong time, and for the wrong reasons? It's not a question meant to flatter our species. It's a question meant to save money, lives, reputations, and occasionally marriages. I still make the same errors I lecture about. That confession is not rhetorical pride, but a necessary fact. Understanding mistakes is easier in the abstract than avoiding them in real time. I'm not offering a philosophy or a sermon. This is a practical toolkit. 20 or so recurring tendencies that, together, explain a surprising amount of human failure. Call them mental models, biases, or predictable reactions. They're shortcuts the brain takes because shortcuts are cheaper than careful thinking. The toolbox is meant for managers, investors, leaders, and anyone who wants to reduce dumb, preventable ruin. If you want a steady, usable framework for spotting these mistakes in the wild, subscribe now, and you'll find this framework slowly becomes a habit, not just an interesting set of anecdotes. Incentives and reinforcement. Say the word incentive and half of human behavior suddenly makes sense. A tiny change in pay structure once fixed an entire overnight delivery system. A small tweak in sales commission rules can transform honorable people into short-term maximizers. Incentives are not metaphors. They are push and pull forces. They reward behavior, and rewarded behavior repeats. One corporate cautionary tale goes like this. Salespeople on commission were rewarded for leasing equipment regardless of whether the customer needed it. What sounded like a legitimate sales incentive produced a cascade of poor decisions, overpromised features, neglected maintenance, and eventually reputational damage that outstripped the short-term gain. The mechanism is straightforward. When the reward connects to a narrow metric, people optimize that metric, often at the expense of broader value. Antidotes are institutional, not moralistic. First, align incentives to the long-term outcome you actually want. Pay attention to unintended consequences. Second, use multi-metric compensation. Mix short-term measures with long-term performance and independent quality checks. Third, include negative reporting in evaluation. Reward people who surface failures early, not those who bury them until a crisis. One practical rule I recommend: any compensation scheme must pass a simple thought experiment. What behavior does this reward if the metric is gamed? If the answer produces perverse or reckless behavior in imagination, don't implement it. Liking and disliking. Humans tend to trust and emulate people we like. Conversely, we dismiss those we dislike. This seems obvious until you realize how many critical decisions, whom to hire, whom to partner with, which ideas to credit, are settled by this feeling. Liking is a powerful reinforcer. People do favors for friends, grant favors to pleasant speakers, and excuse flaws when they're emotionally invested. A historical example in my own experience involved a close advisor whose agreeable manner repeatedly saved his projects from scrutiny. He was likable, so his numbers were rarely questioned. That alone should alarm any manager. Mechanically, liking short-circuit skepticism. It substitutes emotional trust for argumented reasons. Antidotes: institutionalize independent review. Insist on documented reasons for decisions, even when the person proposing them is loved by the team. Rotate who evaluates proposals. reward dissent, and explicitly protect the person who raises uncomfortable questions. A small procedural practice. Require that any proposal with significant budget implications be presented by someone other than its originator at least once to invite objective interrogation. Social proof and proof by association. We copy one another because copying is safe and efficient. In safe environments, that's adaptive. In confusing or stressful situations, it's dangerous. Think of crowded highways where drivers all brake simultaneously because the car in front braked, or investment bubbles where early buying begets later buying until everyone is exposed. Social proof amplifies uncertainty into unanimity. Classic psychological research shows how people take cues from others when their own information is weak. The mechanism is simple. If you're unsure, the behavior of the crowd becomes evidence. The consequence is group-level error, herding, cascades, and the sudden convergence of judgment on bad ideas. Antidotes. Break the crowd dynamic before it begins. Encourage private preliminaries. Have people make independent assessments before group discussion. Use blind evaluation where practical. Require written assumptions before revealing others' opinions. For markets and teams alike, appoint a defensible contrarian, someone whose job is to model the consequences of the unpopular view and pressure test the consensus. Consistency, commitment, and the avoidance of doubt. Once people commit, verbally, publicly, or by small acts, they prefer consistency. It's easier to double down than to change course. Commitments function like economic sunk costs plus a moral badge. We feel obligated to be the same person we already acted to be. The mechanics involve cognitive dissonance and social signaling. Public commitments stiffen armor around fragile judgments. That's how a minor initial error becomes a chain of bad decisions. A manager approves a pilot. The pilot shows minor early problems. The manager damns reports to keep the project alive rather than admitting a mistake. Antidotes. Use pre-commitment wisely and design escape hatches. Require decision memos that include exit criteria before the project starts. A cut-loss rule is a practical example. For any project or investment above a defined threshold, document in advance the conditions under which you will stop and the timeline for evaluation. A sample cut-loss template, state the objective, list 3 measurable signals that indicate failure, set a fixed calendar review, and name the independent reviewer with authority to halt progress. Legally bind the rule into governance if necessary. Executive committees should not be allowed to ignore their own documented exit criteria without a 2/3 vote plus independent justification in writing. Availability bias. Vivid, recent, or memorable events loom larger in our minds than they merit. The loudest story wins, not the most representative data. Media coverage of dramatic events skews public perception of probability. The airplane crash is memorable, but it's not the primary risk for most travelers. The mechanism is memory salience. What you can call up easily feels probable. For investors, it explains why the latest headline drives portfolio changes. For managers, why the most recent disaster receives disproportionate attention despite being statistically rare. Availability makes dramatic evidence overweighted. Antidotes make base rates visible, require summary statistics rather than anecdotes when making policy or investment decisions. Use simple spreadsheets or visualizations that show frequency, not just instances. Teach teams to ask Compared to what? Before responding to any vivid case. Loss aversion, endowment effect, and the status quo bias. Losing hurts more than gaining pleases. People overreact to potential losses and, by extension, cling to what they have. This explains a lot. Why companies keep underperforming divisions alive, why owners demand higher prices than the market will pay, and why markets can be slow to correct. Loss aversion works emotionally and economically. The disutility of loss is larger than the utility of equal gain. The endowment effect follows. Once we own something, our valuation inflates. If policymakers or managers are not aware of this tilt, they'll make decisions that preserve the present at irrational cost. Antidotes: quantify trade-offs and separate ownership from evaluation. Use independent valuation and require market testing of suggested hold decisions. For personal choices, implement a cooling-off rule. Delay important decisions, list the counterfactuals, and get an external valuation where possible. Reciprocity, the grease of social cooperation and the lubricant of manipulation. Reciprocity evolved to stabilize cooperation. Do someone a favor, and they'll often return it. But reciprocity can be weaponized. Organizations that allow acceptance of gifts, perks, or favors create invisible obligations. Sam Walton recognized this and forbade employees from accepting gifts. He was trying to prevent reciprocity from biasing decisions. Reciprocity's mechanism is automatic. An unsolicited favor creates psychological indebtedness. In business, this yields tendering problems, procurement biases, and conflicts of interest. In politics or warfare, reciprocity can escalate into cycles of revenge. Antidotes: limit or ban gifts in decision-making spheres, require disclosure of potential reciprocal relationships, create cooling periods between gift receipt and decisions impacting the giver. Train people to view favors as signals to be archived, not as private debts to be repaid. Association and conditioning. Pavlov ring a bell. People salivate at meaning-laden stimuli long after the original connection. Ivan Pavlov's dog's conditioned to respond to arbitrary cues is not just laboratory curiosity. It's a model for marketing, habit formation, and social contagion. B.F. Skinner extended this with operant conditioning. Rewards and punishments shape behavior. Conditioning is powerful because it can operate below conscious detection. Advertisers know this. Cult leaders know this. So should managers trying to avoid creating maladaptive habits in their teams. Stress magnifies conditioning. Pavlov's later work and subsequent replications show that stress can sharpen conditioned responses, but also disrupt flexible behavior. Antidotes: control your environment intentionally, design cues that encourage desirable habits, and eliminate cues that provoke harmful automatic responses. When training people for rare events, use repetition and realistic simulation. Flight simulators do not merely teach procedures. They create conditioned responses that work under stress. When you must break a conditioned reaction, substitute alternative cues and reward the new behavior consistently for an extended period. Overconfidence and excess self-regard. People overestimate their capabilities. Investors believe their stock-picking skill is higher than average. Managers believe their strategy will defy odds. Overconfidence nests with optimism, bias to produce fragile plans. The mechanism involves calibration errors in self-assessment and the human tendency to construct coherent narratives that exaggerate control. consequences vary from poor risk management to catastrophic organizational decisions withheld for too long. Antidotes: force probabilistic estimates. Make people state confidence intervals or assign probabilities to outcomes. Use outside view techniques. Ask, what happened in comparable situations, rather than relying on a version of events that flatters current judgment. Keep score, track past predictions, and show the win-loss record of forecasting to blunt unjustified confidence. Denial and motivated reasoning. When the stakes are high and the truth painful, people do not simply make arithmetic errors. They actively avoid certain lines of evidence. Motivated reasoning lets us assemble arguments that support a preferred conclusion while ignoring disconfirming data. Denial can be institutional as well as individual. Mechanically, motivated reasoning employs available mental resources to shield identity, income, or status. The consequence is tragic inertia. Firms keep poor lines alive, and leaders rationalize away the slow erosion of value. Antidotes: institutionalize contrarian processes. Use pre-mortems where teams imagine failure and backfill the reasons why. Create anonymous channels for bad news reporting and protect those who provide it. Managers should explicitly reward the person who finds the problem, not the person who conceals it. Authority, influence, and obedience. Stanley Milgram's experiments in the 1960s reminded us that ordinary people will perform harmful acts when an authority figure directs them. The task in modern organizations is not to frighten people about authority per se, but to design structures that channel legitimate authority while limiting blind obedience. Authoritative commands substitute external legitimacy for personal moral calculus. The consequence: people lower their guard and suspend skepticism. In some contexts, authority saves time. In others, it destroys prudence. Antidotes: create permission to question cultures. Require that major directives include documented reasons and counter-arguments. Implement two-person rules in critical decisions. No one acts alone when the stakes are high. Rotate roles and require dissenting reports explicitly. Contrast and escalation by small steps. Contrast effects are pernicious because small changes are less noticeable than big ones. The frog in slowly warming water is the canonical image. Incremental acceptance of worse outcomes goes unchallenged because each step doesn't feel large. The mechanism is habituation. People adapt to gradual deterioration and institutional momentum takes over. Small tolerances accumulate into major defects. Safety standards relax. Cost-cutting becomes a culture. A department slowly loses competence. Antidotes: impose periodic absolute checks. Audit systems should include absolute thresholds that do not slide with circumstance. Safety inspectors should compare to fixed standards, not to last year's worst baseline. Use rival comparison points. Ask how a fresh outsider would judge a process that has degraded incrementally. Vividness and memory manipulation. Vivid stories stick to minds more readily than quiet data. That makes sense for communication, but is lethal as evidence. A dramatic incident will determine policy if leaders do not correct for the pull of vividness. The mechanism is cognitive. Emotionally salient memories are easier to retrieve and therefore feel more reliable. The consequence is policy overreaction to flashy cases and undercommitment to mundane but more dangerous risks. Antidotes: prefer systematic data to anecdotes. When a story is compelling, force it into a spreadsheet. How many times has this happened over the relevant time frame? And what does that imply about risk? Use simple math and base rates to dilute the spark of the anecdote. Stress and cognitive collapse. Stress does not merely make people uncomfortable. Under acute stress, cognitive processes collapse and simple heuristics dominate. Skinner warned about mechanical behaviorism. Later work shows that under pressure, people revert to conditioned responses, social cues, and authority signals. The mechanism is neurobiological. Stress floods cognitive resources, reducing working memory and flexibility. Under stress, even skilled people perform badly. They forget checklists, ignore counter-evidence, and latch onto the most salient cue. Antidotes are procedural and prophylactic. Rehearse critical actions under stress in simulations. Keep checklists for high-pressure moments. Flight crews do not improvise landing sequences. They call checklists. Implement timeouts for major decisions. Mandate cooling periods when possible, and discourage snap decisions driven by adrenaline. At this point, you might be thinking, these are a lot of bad habits. They are, but they are not mysteries. Each tendency has a clear mechanism and a practical remedy. The real danger occurs when these tendencies combine. Incentives that reward short-term metrics create social proof cascades. Stress magnifies conditioning and makes authority unchallengeable. Availability bias sells the vivid story that justifies a perverse incentive. Consider a composite example that is all too familiar in corporate life. A tight quarterly target creates an incentive structure that values short-term numbers. A charismatic sales manager, liked by the team, models aggressive account recognition methods. Social proof takes over. Others imitate because the manager's behavior seems to validate the approach. The company's reporting culture discourages bad news, so early warning signs get hidden. Under end-of-quarter stress, people stick to the plan and escalate the misreporting by small steps until auditors discover a massive hole. At the center, incentives, liking, social proof, lack of dissent, and stress working together. You can already see how the antidotes begin to cross-cut. Align incentives with long-term measures. Require independent reviews. Reward bad news reporting. Enforce exit rules. And rehearse stressful scenarios so automatic responses are useful rather than harmful. There is no single fix. The right protection is institutional redundancy. Checks and balances in people, process, and math. Before I move on to deeper case studies, where I'll map exactly which combination of tendencies created famous disasters, I want to give you two concrete templates you can use immediately. A bad news reporting rule. Any team lead who becomes aware of a material negative deviation from plan, financial, safety, reputational, must file a simple deviation notice within 48 hours. The notice contains 3 elements: what happened, why it matters, 1 paragraph, and the remedial options considered with a preferred immediate action. The person who files the notice receives protection from reprisal for 60 days, and the notice is routed to an independent review panel that must meet within 5 business days. The performance metric for executives explicitly credits early reporting by increasing a transparency score that contributes to year-end evaluation. A cut-loss rule for investments or projects. Before committing more than X dollars or Y months, write a decision charter that lists the objective baseline metrics, 3 failure thresholds, e.g., Y burn rate. The charter also includes a documented write-down process to record what went wrong, who knew what when, and what will change. I can hear the skepticism. These sound bureaucratic. They are, because human fallibility is stubborn. Bureaucracy is useful when it catches that one human moment everyone regrets. Rules aren't a substitute for judgment, but they are insurance against bad judgment. I will confess a personal mistake. Years ago, I let pride and a persuasive advisor keep me from heeding contrary signals. We had a promising investment thesis, and I was so taken with the narrative that I postponed a rigorous outside review. The cost was not apocalyptic, but it was large enough to sting and to teach me a lesson I didn't want to learn in the school of pain. It reinforced a rule I now recommend to every committee I run. Never let the first champion of an idea be the sole judge of its merit. What I haven't yet mapped, and what is critical, is the anatomy of catastrophes, where several tendencies conspire under stress and confusion to produce outcomes that no single biased instinct could have produced alone. That is where moral hazard becomes systemic, and where the safeguards must be institutionalized rather than left to character. Now let's map how those tendencies collide and produce the kind of disasters you read about in the papers. Cases where no single error explains the outcome, only their poisonous interaction. I'll sketch 3 composite case studies: an organizational accounting collapse, a cult-like organizational breakdown, and a wartime command failure. For each, I'll identify the mental mistakes at work, show the sequence that turns small errors into catastrophe, and point to the concrete institutional fixes that would have stopped it. Case Study 1. The numbers game that became a scandal. Imagine a company under extreme quarterly pressure. Targets are tightened, bonuses are paid on reported revenue. That's incentives in the raw. The sales team leader is charismatic, liked by the staff, and rewarded for short-term closes. Liking and reciprocity make the team deferential to him. He models a slightly aggressive accounting treatment. Recognize revenue when a deal is probable, rather than when it's certain. Others follow because of social proof. If the team leader does it and no one is punished, it must be acceptable. The CFO, encountering troubling anomalies, hesitates to report them because the corporate culture subtly punishes bearers of bad news. Denial and suppression of negative reports set in. Each small step is slight. A tweak to a recognition policy here, a little more optimistic estimate there. Contrast and small steps escalation. Hide the drift. Endowment and loss. Aversion. Keep executives clinging to the narrative that the company is fundamentally sound. Cutting the project now feels like admitting a loss. The result? A cascade of misstatements that, once uncovered, ruins reputations and destroys shareholder value. What stopped it in the better-run firms? Institutional redundancy. Independent audits with real teeth. 2-person rules for accounting decisions that exceed thresholds. Explicit protection and reward for early reporting of deviations. Compensation tied to long-term measures rather than quarterly pumps. And pre-registered exit rules for any revenue recognition policy changes. If you want to know where to start, align incentives and require that any change in recognition or performance metric must be approved by an independent panel that includes someone whose compensation is not tied to the metric. Simple, obvious, effective. Case Study 2, the organizational cult. This is an extreme but instructive example. A founder builds a ritualized environment. Intense loyalty is rewarded, frequent group praise is the norm, and dissenting voices are gently sidelined. Conditioning and association do the heavy lifting. Repetitive rituals, shared symbols, and daily success stories create automatic responses of loyalty. Reciprocity deepens the bond. Early adopters are lavishly rewarded, creating obligations. Social proof makes the outsider feel wrong or deficient. Under stress, say a tough quarter, the group doubles down. Authority influence increases. Orders from the founder are taken as moral imperatives. Motivated reasoning and denial rationalize any evidence that threatens the myth. Small-step escalations transform minor ethical lapses into systemic abuse. Why does this occur? Because the architecture of the organization rewards ritualized conformity and punishes curiosity. Good antidotes reverse the reward structure, hire independent directors who report to a separate committee, set up anonymous channels for complaint with guaranteed non-retaliation, rotate leadership roles so no single person accumulates too much unquestioned authority, and insist on external validation for the most exalted claims. Train people to run pre-mortems and to model failure scenarios. Make contrarian perspective a formal role, with time allocated and compensation attached. Case Study 3, the decision era that cost lives. Consider a tactical military decision under intense time pressure. A commanding officer, confident from past successes, believes a particular maneuver will work. Overconfidence and narrative coherence at play. Junior officers, trained to obey and to avoid upsetting superiors, fail to voice doubts. Authority influence and a culture that discourages bad news reporting. The operation is staged in incremental, almost imperceptible steps. Each small concession looks trivial, contrast, and small steps. In the resulting stress environment, conditioned responses and rote procedures replace flexible thinking. Teams follow the leader's dictum rather than pause to test assumptions. This scenario is why the military and aviation communities emphasize checklists, two-person rules, and simulated stress training. The antidotes are procedural, mandate a pause and question moment before executing any high-stakes action, require a dissenting officer to present alternative plans, rehearse disaster scenarios so instinctive reactions are useful instead of destructive. These are not theoretical niceties, they are life-saving protocols. Across these stories, a pattern is clear. The most dangerous failures arise when structural incentives, social dynamics, and cognitive shortcuts converge under stress. That insight should make you less interested in blaming individuals and more interested in designing institutions that make bad behavior hard and good behavior easy. Now let's talk about the managerial toolbox. Practical rules and templates you can adapt to your organization. I'll be explicit because vague platitudes don't change behavior. I'll offer rules, checklists, and simple governance templates that reduce exposure to the most common failure modes. Management rules and practices that work. 1. Align incentives to outcomes you genuinely care about. The first question for any compensation or performance metric is not, will this drive X behavior? But, what will people do if they only care about this metric? Run the mental experiment. Imagine ruthless gaming of your metric. Does that produce behavior you're willing to accept? If not, redesign. Prefer multidimensional pay, short-term performance, medium-term quality measures, and a long-term residual stake or clawback. Where possible, delay final compensation until independent verification is available. 2. Reward bad news reporting, instantly and visibly. Create a transparency score that factors into yearly evaluation, early reporting of deviations, caveats added to memos, and documented instances where dissent altered a decision should be explicitly credited. Make the procedure public so everyone knows the system favors truth-tellers. 3. Make contrarians pay a salary. Hire or appoint a named skeptic, a contrarian officer whose job is to challenge assumptions. Give her time, data access, and align directly to the board or the equivalent oversight body. Don't outsource skepticism to random meetings. Institutionalize it. 4. Pre-commitment and exit rules. For every substantial project, require a decision charter. Objective, horizon, 3 measurable failure thresholds, a mandatory review date, and an independent arbitrator empowered to stop the project. Bind this into governance so that canceling a project requires fewer barriers than continuing one that has hit 2 failure signals. This is a cultural trick. Make stopping the default when objective evidence is negative. 5. 2-person rules and independent checks. For critical decisions, significant accounting judgments, safety overrides, major hires require 2 independent approvals. The second approver must be trained to look for conflicts and cross-check assumptions, not merely rubber-stamp the first. 6. Checklists and training under stress. Use checklists for crucial sequences. Simulate rare events regularly so conditioned responses are helpful. Aviation is the model. The point is not that checklists are magical, it's that they are practiced under simulated stress until they work when it matters. 7. Blind and independent assessments. For evaluations where social proof might bias outcomes, use blind scoring, anonymous proposals, or third-party audits. Where feasible, have initial recommendations made in private, then revealed after independent consideration has been recorded. 8. Premortems and postmortems. Before you commit, run a premortem. Assume the project failed and write down all plausible causes. After a failure, run a postmortem that focuses on systemic causes, not heroically blaming the last person to touch the problem. 9. Limit gifts and require disclosure. Prohibit acceptance of gifts in decision-making roles or impose cooling-off periods and full disclosure rules. Sam Walton's policy of limiting gifts in retail operations is a good model. Make conflict avoidance institutional rather than rely on personal virtue. 10. Use the outside view and require probabilistic reasoning. For major decisions, ask for a distribution of outcomes and an outside case comparison. Don't accept confident point predictions without calibration exercises that compare past forecasts to realized outcomes. Now some concrete templates and checklists you can copy, adapt, and embed in governance documents. Decision Charter Template, short form, project name and sponsor. Objective, 1 clear sentence. Investment threshold, financial time. Baseline metrics, 3 primary KPIs. Failure thresholds, 3 measurable signals that indicate material underperformance. Mandatory review dates. Independent arbitrator, named person or panel with authority to stop. Communication rule, who must be informed within 48 hours if a threshold is crossed. post-cancellation requirements, post-mortem lessons, and mandatory documentation. Sample project launch checklist. Brief. Have objectives been written and agreed in one sentence? Are baseline metrics defined and measurable? Has a cut-loss rule been added to the project charter? Is an independent reviewer named and available? Has at least one contrarian perspective been solicited and documented? Is there a schedule for stress testing and simulation before scale-up? Are reporting channels for negative deviations defined and protected? Bad news reporting policy, one-paragraph version. Any material deviation of project performance from agreed baselines must be reported within 48 hours, using a deviation notice that includes A, a concise description of the deviation, B, why it matters, one paragraph, and C, immediate remedial options and the sponsor's recommended action. The reporter receives protection from reprisal for 60 days. Deviation notices are routed to the independent review panel, which must convene within 5 business days. Early reporting increases the reporter's transparency score, which is considered in annual performance reviews. Pre-mortem script, facilitator notes, set a 45-minute session with the project sponsor and 3 independent participants. Prompt. Assume the project failed spectacularly. Spend 20 minutes writing reasons why it failed. Each participant lists at least 5 plausible causes. Then spend 20 minutes discussing remediation and verifying whether any of these causes are plausible today. End with a short action list. What changes to the plan will prevent those failure modes? Record the session and file it with the decision charter. Cut-loss rule, example language. Before committing resources beyond threshold T, time or money, document 3 failure indicators. If 2 of the 3 indicators are met at or before the mandatory review date, halt further funding. The independent arbitrator's decision is binding absent a 2/3 board vote to override, which must be accompanied by a written rationale and signed by at least 2 unrelated executives. These are the kinds of institutional devices that convert wisdom into practice. They look bureaucratic because they are. Bureaucracy is the sewage treatment of human frailty. It is not glamorous, but it prevents people from flushing fortunes and reputations down the drain. Now, let's turn down from institutions to the level of the individual. Managers change behavior by changing daily habits. Here are compact, high-leverage practices you can adopt without organizational fiat. Personal practices and heuristics to improve judgment. 1. Write your reasons down. Before a significant decision, write a 1-page memo. The thesis, key assumptions, major risks, and what evidence would change your mind. If you can't do this, don't act. 2. Use the pre-mortem on yourself. If you're the sponsor, imagine failure and list plausible causes. You'll be surprised how often you missed an obvious dependency. 3. The 5 alternatives rule. For important choices, require 5 credible alternatives considered and why each was rejected. If you can't find 5, your search has been shallow. 4. Assign probabilities and track them. Give your estimate a range and a confidence interval. Keep a log of predictions and their outcomes to calibrate your judgment. It's humbling, but it works. 5. Delay public pronouncements. If you feel compelled to make a big public prediction, wait. Public commitment hardens into consistency pressure. Give yourself a cooling-off period to avoid being locked in by your own rhetoric. 6. Regularly rehearse rare but critical skills. If you manage a crisis-prone function, Run tabletop exercises quarterly. Practice under stress so your conditioned responses are the ones you want. 7. Recruit disconfirming evidence deliberately. Ask someone you trust to find the best case against your plan. Pay them to be right. Compensation buys effort. 8. Curate your social feeds. Social proof is contagious. Surround yourself with people who tell uncomfortable truths as well as pleasant ones. 9. Limit the number of decisions you make daily. Decision fatigue is real. Make structural choices, calendars, routines, small automation that reduce trivial decisions and preserve cognitive energy for consequential ones. 10. Keep a mistakes ledger. Record misjudgments. What you decided, the reasons, and what you missed. Revisit this ledger quarterly. If you do not learn from your past, you will repeat it. Let me be blunt. None of these practices are exotic. Their power lies in consistent use. The human brain prefers shortcuts. You counter that preference with externally enforced routines until better habits take hold. A deeper look at interactions, mapping complex failures step by step. It's worth returning to interaction effects because they're where simple rules fail and layered defenses succeed. Let's take a hypothetical but realistic scenario and map it as a flowchart in prose. Seeing it step by step helps you design a defense. Scenario: a bank expands into aggressive mortgage lending during a period of rising home prices. 1. Incentives. Loan officers are paid on volume. Origination fees increase, so more loans equal higher pay. The bank's bonus structure does not claw back when loans default. 2. Social proof. Early cohorts of loans perform well as house prices rise. Senior managers praise the growth and spotlight the top originators. 3. Overconfidence. Executives narrate a grand thesis. Our underwriting is superior, and housing never goes down. Confidence becomes doctrine. 4. Availability bias. Recent headlines of big housing gains dominate management attention. Problems in other markets are dismissed as irrelevant. 5. Consistency and commitment. After hitting growth targets, the bank publicly celebrates the strategy, which hardens commitment to the approach. 6. Small step escalation. Underwriting standards loosen incrementally, lower down payments, looser documentation, more exceptions. Each step is small and justifiable. 7. Denial and motivated reasoning. When some loans show early stress, teams explain away the signs, blaming unique borrower circumstances rather than systemic issues. 8. Stress. If a market shock hits, stressed employees revert to conditioned behaviors, aggressive collection scripts, or stopgap capital measures that are tactical rather than strategic. 9. Authority. A charismatic CEO orders a quick expansion into another region. Local managers obey, trusting the CEO's narrative. 10. Collapse. The market turns, losses mount, capital erodes, and the firm faces a solvency crisis. Now, how would we have stopped that? A combination of measures: separate incentive systems, no origination-only pay, periodic independent stress tests, mandatory external validators for underwriting changes, a named contrarian with access to the board, enforceable cut-loss rules for portfolios showing early degradation, and pre-registered triggers that force board-level review if exceptions exceed a threshold. That's the point. Single tools won't stop it. Layered defenses will. The ethics of knowledge. How to use this toolbox responsibly. A brief but important aside. Some books teach how to persuade and manipulate, how to exploit reciprocity, authority, and conditioning. Understanding those levers puts responsibility on you. You can design incentives and environments to produce obedience and exploitation, or you can use that knowledge to erect safeguards. I encourage the latter. When you describe manipulation techniques in your organization, do so as part of a protective program. Teach people how to recognize undue influence, require disclosures, and build consent protocols where relationships are at risk of conflict. Limitations and caveats. A sober point before we close. These tendencies are strong but not immutable. They vary with culture, personality, and context. Someone may be unusually skeptical, resilient to social proof, or highly numerate. Institutions will always be the decisive variable. Good institutions reduce error rates across a population. But don't treat these fixes as magic. They reduce risk. They do not eliminate it. Always err on the side of humility when you measure the future. A few simple heuristics for leaders to keep in their pocket. Assume you are biased. Design systems that do not rely on your self-control. Reward truth, not cheerleading. Make early problem finding a visible virtue. Make it easy to stop projects, hard to continue them when evidence is negative. Practice probabilistic thinking publicly. Model your uncertainty. Hire for character and contrarian competence. Skill is necessary, but skepticism is an institutional asset. Of final personal confession, and the lesson I keep, I have one more confession to make. Some years back, I ignored contrary signals because of narrative enchantment. We had a thesis that fit a tidy story. The market would value a particular asset class in a way that, if true, promised large returns. I was busy and trusted a persuasive champion, someone I liked and who was rewarded for raising money. We skipped the rigorous outside reviews I now require. The numbers diverged from the story sooner than anyone wanted to say. By the time we pulled back, the loss was significant enough that I felt the sting for months. It was not a career ender, but it was a clear, personal, avoidable mistake. I share it because you should know. These are not academic problems. They cost people money, careers, and sleep. They are also solvable if you redesign the environment around decisions. A condensed list of practical rules to internalize right now. 1. Align incentives to true outcomes and test them for gaming. 2. Reward early reporting of bad news. 3. Insist on independent review for important changes. 4. Use pre-commitment and cut-loss rules for large commitments. 5. Institutionalize contrarian roles and outside views. 6. Practice checklists and simulations for high-pressure tasks. 7. Keep a judgment ledger to learn from mistakes. 8. Make probabilistic thinking a visible part of your process. Pick one of those and apply it this week. Here's a tiny exercise you can do right now. Choose an upcoming decision that matters to you, an investment, a hire, a strategic pivot, and write a one-paragraph decision charter. State the objective, list 1 or 2 measurable failure thresholds, and put a date on the mandatory review. If you do that, you've already moved from theory to practice. Final thoughts. Why this matters. Why be so systematic about biases and misjudgment? Because the failures that matter are usually not the product of villainy or stupidity. They are the product of incentives misaligned, of social momentum, and of cognitive shortcuts that make the path of least resistance also the path to ruin. Design matters more than willpower. If you're a manager, an investor, or a citizen who cares about institutions, your job is to make good behavior structural and bad behavior costly or hard. We've gone through a long list: reinforcement, liking, social proof, commitment, availability bias, loss aversion, reciprocity, conditioning, overconfidence, denial, authority, contrast effects, small step escalation, and more, and we've seen how they combine. You don't need to memorize every label. You do need to build a habit. When a decision is important, slow down, write down your reasons, model the outside case, solicit someone who will disagree, and bind your future self with exit rules. One aphorism I return to often: small leaks sink big ships. A tiny incentive misfire or a slight cultural tilt left unchecked compounds with other small failures until the ship founders. The remedy is not heroic heroics. It's steady maintenance, good rules, frequent inspections, empowered skeptics, and a culture that prizes truth over comfort. If this framework has been useful, try one thing this week. Write a short decision charter for an upcoming important choice and stick to one of the cut-loss rules we discussed. See what you learn? If you want more practical frameworks delivered regularly, mental models, checklists, and case studies that make these ideas operational, subscribe for more. Share this with a colleague who runs decisions or a leader who needs a practical manual for better judgment. We need more people designing institutions that resist our worst impulses and reward our best thinking. Thank you for staying with me through this deep dive into Munger-style insights on human judgment mistakes. Remember, we are not helpless. We are predictable. And where we are predictable, we can be designed around.